Let's talk about how Christian Zionism is funded to the scale of billions of dollars on behalf of everyday people in the United States. Every Sunday, millions of families in this country make their way to their local church, and the majority of those churches stand behind the settler occupation of the State of Israel, no matter the cost. The money behind the powerful and harmful ideology of Christian Zionism is one of the most corrupt and immoral things in today's world. As the third part of my series on Christian Zionism, this segment might be the most important. Welcome back to the Kayse Melone Show. My name is Kayse Melone, and I'm so glad you're here. If you've been following this series on Christian Zionism, let's do a quick recap. In part 1, we went all the way back to trace the theological roots of this ideology. We talked about how 16th century figures like Martin Luther and John Bale were working out their anxieties about Catholic power, the rise of Catholic power on one side and the Ottoman Empire on the other, and how those anxieties led to an apocalyptic framework where Jews weren't seen as, actual people with their own history and agency, but as chess pieces in a cosmic battle that had to end in a particular way for Jesus to come back. Not to mention how the book of Revelation, commonly used in Christian teachings about the end times, which I can attest to as someone raised in evangelical Christianity, talks about a supposed future prophecy in which Jewish people have to die in multitudes for Jesus to return, in order for Jesus to return. So Christian Zionism at best sees Jewish people as pawns, and at worst sees them as a required sacrifice. We also explored how that framework evolved into dispensationalism, rapture ideology, and that infamous bless Israel or be cursed mantra that a lot of us grew up hearing in church. In other words, the theology that makes Christian Zionism not just a political opinion, but a religious obligation. Then, in part 2, we followed that theology as it wormed its way into United States politics. We looked at how a disciplined evangelical voting bloc, many of them raised on those same apocalyptic sermons, became a reliable machine for the Republican Party. So if part 1 was the theological origin story, and part 2 was the political takeover, then part 3 is where we follow the money. Because, and this is the part your old Sunday school teacher probably didn't put in the sermon, if theology is like the soul of Christian Zionism and politics is like the body and how it manifests in the physical realm, then money is the bloodstream. It's the life source of how all of this whole entire fucking empire stays alive. So today we're talking about the billion-dollar machinery behind Christian Zionism, who funds it, who profits from it, and how donations, media, and lobbying turn prophecy into policy and policy into even more cash for just a select few people. And here's the thing. People like to pretend that religion and politics and money are all separate concepts, that faith is something pure and noble and a relationship with Jesus Christ, and money is at best a necessary evil to keep the lights on at the church. But Christian Zionism is just one of the many examples that proves otherwise. I've talked a lot about the prosperity gospel, which is a widely taught phenomenon in Christianity that suggests that the richer you are, the more beloved you are by God, which is a really convenient way for megachurch pastors to convince their congregation members to give them more money. But Christian Zionism isn't just about supporting God's chosen people out of some selfless sense of duty. This is an industry. It is fundraising, it is lobbying, it is a media empire network, it is donor networks, there are tax loopholes involved, the whole capitalist toolkit, all in the name of a he, him pronouns shepherd God, okay? And what I'm really trying to get across here is for everyday Christians to really question why their pastors are telling them to support Israel no matter what. Like, take the Bible out of the equation just as a thought experiment. Who does Christian Zionism actually serve? Because Christian Zionism is basically a hybrid movement. It's partly about theology and like Christian mythology, but it's also partly about like a political coalition between all of these major powers. And it's also this like fundraising machine to transfer even more wealth to the powerful people. And the thing about fundraising machines in a capitalist capitalist society is they're designed to grow. They need constant input and surplus values and optimization and all of that bullshit, which means the sermons, the TV programs, the lectures, the conferences furthering the United States Christian support for Israel at all costs, even genocidal costs, all of it is calibrated not just to spread the gospel, but to generate revenue, again, for specific parties involved. And that revenue isn't just paying for the preacher's new 5-story mansion. It's also funding settlement construction in the West Bank. It's keeping think tanks afloat so they can pump out policy papers justifying the next military aid package. If you take away anything from this podcast segment, from my platform, from me as a person, remember this: religion is always a tool of empire used to manufacture consent for a state-sanctioned violence. That's it. There's no denomination or version of Christianity in this country that makes up for the entirety of violence and colonialism and bigotry brought about by the Christian justification of supposed moral values. Moving on. Le Monde did a piece last year about how American evangelicals mobilize for Israel, and one pastor was pretty blunt about it. Every fundraising drive is also a discipleship drive. Give to Israel, be blessed. Withhold, be cursed. That's the pitch. It's literally that simple, and I can attest to it. I heard that sermon broken down basically a million times growing up. And when you realize that pitch gets delivered to millions of people every single week across pulpits and Christian schools and podcasts and primetime Christian television, you start to see why this isn't about faith at all. It's not about a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's about power and capitalism too. And I'm not saying that every person writing a check to support Israel is some raging, bigoted asshole. A lot of them are just sincere believers who were told that this is what God wants from them. In a lot of ways, they're victims of this very intentional and manufactured propaganda machine. And many Christians have woken up to the atrocities committed in the name of their he/him pronouns shepherd God, but sincerity doesn't change the fact that the overarching system is set up to take that money, their money, launder it through a nonprofit status, and funnel it into projects that entrench apartheid, silence dissent, and make a handful of people very, very rich in the process. So today we're going to follow that money trail. We'll start with the mega donors, the people whose names you probably have heard because they're splashed all over like political coverage and commentary. Then we'll work our way down through the power organizations, the televangelists, the lobbying machines, the settlement pipelines, the so-called humanitarian aid groups, and finally, the everyday tithers that keep the base tapped in. And along the way, we're going to connect the dots between Christian mythology and capitalism. When we talk about the money behind Christian Zionism, we can't skip over the billionaires who bankroll it all. And if there's a power couple whose names have become synonymous with this intersection of ideology and influence, it's Sheldon and Miriam Adelson. Now, Sheldon Adelson, the late casino magnate, and his wife Miriam didn't exactly grow up in the pews of a Christian megachurch in Texas or what the fuck ever. Their connection to Christian Zionism was more strategic in nature. They understood something that political operatives have known for decades. If you can lock in the evangelical Christian base in the United States, you control one of the most reliable voting blocks in this country. And that block will show up for policies that line up with your foreign policy goals every single time, especially when those goals involve Israel. Miriam Adelson personally gave around $173 million to Republican candidates and committees in the 2020 election cycle. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's not, we passed the plate and gave generously based on our own income this month. That's, we could buy a small country money. And it paid off for them. When Donald Trump moved the United States Embassy to Jerusalem in 2018, a move evangelicals hailed as a prophetic milestone, it wasn't just a symbolic victory, it was a political return on investment for donors like the Adelsons, who had been pushing for that policy change for years. Open Secrets, the nonpartisan watchdog, lists the Adelsons as one of the top political donors in that cycle, and their money didn't just go to candidates. It flowed into political action committees, super PACs, and advocacy groups that make sure pro-Israel policies, and specifically Christian Zionist aligned policies stay at the top of the Republican agenda. We're talking about things like maintaining that $3.8 billion annual military aid to Israel, blocking any attempts to condition that aid on human rights compliance, and passing anti-BDS laws that punish people for boycotting Israeli goods. And here's the kicker. The Adelsons weren't operating in a vacuum. They were part of a donor ecosystem that includes hedge fund managers, real estate moguls, and oil money, people whose personal wealth allows them to basically run their own foreign policy. Miriam Adelson's giving spiked again in the last midterm cycle, funding groups that explicitly target pro-Palestinian voices in Congress. This is a political business model. Spend big enough to get the policies you want, then leverage those policies to strengthen the alliance between Israeli politics and the United States evangelical base. And it's not just about cutting checks to politicians either. These megadonors sponsor galas, bankroll think tanks, and fund educational trips to Israel for pastors and young evangelicals. You've probably seen photos of congressional delegations standing on a hill in the West Bank, looking out over Palestinian villages, being told by a guide whose salary is paid by one of these donors that they're looking at the biblical heartland rather than occupied territory. That's an investment in narrative control, not adherence to some mythology that I personally don't even think they actually believe in. And while the Adelsons are Jewish, a significant number of the big money players in this space are evangelicals themselves who are underwriting the infrastructure of Christian Zionism via conferences, lobby days, the glossy documentaries that air on Trinity Broadcasting Network. They know that if you can keep the base emotionally invested in Israel as like a prophetic necessity, and you fearmonger to their concerns about apocalyptic end times, you'll never have to fight for their votes or their donations. They'll be on autopilot. And that's what we see happening. And that's the environment I was raised in and witnessed firsthand. So if the billionaires are the financiers of all of this, of Christian Zionism, there are organizations who act more like the middlemen, who like take the money, package it, and then deliver it straight into the hands of politicians and congregations. And at the top of that list is Christians United for Israel, better known as CUFI. CUFI was founded by Pastor John Hagee in 2006, and if you've never been to one of their Washington summits, congratulations. But basically imagine the Republican National Convention as a like megachurch revival, but with more Israeli flags than American ones. CUFI claims over 10 million members, which is a self-reported number, but even if you cut that in half, that's still a massive block of people ready to be mobilized. Every year, they bus pastors, church leaders, and everyone, basically, to Capitol Hill for lobby days, where they meet with members of Congress and deliver talking points that sound eerily similar to what you'd hear from AIPAC staffers. And yes, that's not a coincidence. Hagee has essentially acted as a mouthpiece for Benjamin Netanyahu's government, repeating Israeli government talking points almost verbatim. CUFI's influence over the GOP platform is well documented, from unqualified support for Israeli settlement expansion to opposition to any Palestinian statehood initiatives. They both cheerlead existing policy, and they actively work to write the next set of policies. Financially, CUFI is no small operation at all. They can brag about millions in annual revenue, a chunk of which goes to quote-unquote educational activities, which can include everything from producing Israel-focused curriculum for churches to underwriting trips to Israel for United States lawmakers. And let's be crystal fucking clear. These trips are not about learning about both sides. It's not really about education at all. These are carefully curated propaganda tours. You'll not be spending your evenings chatting with Palestinian civil society leaders. You'll be walking through settlement neighborhoods while your guide tells you how these communities fulfill biblical prophecy. It is sick and disgusting. What I'm talking about here is why I will stand by the idea that Christianity causes more harm than good, but I'll get to that in a bit. There's also the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, the IFCJ. If CUFI is the political arm, IFCJ is like more of an emotional tangent when we talk about Christian Zionism. They raise over $100 million per year, sometimes closer to $130 million, largely from evangelical donors in the United States and Canada. Their marketing strategy is like a fucking masterclass in guilt and fear-based marketing. Think about late night TV spots and direct mail campaigns telling Christians that Jews in Israel are in urgent need and that by giving you're helping fulfill biblical prophecy about the gathering of the Jewish people. Remember, though, that actual biblical prophecy requires these Jewish people in the Middle East to be brutally slaughtered. But the everyday fearful Christian doesn't have the education to understand that. But the catch is that all of it is tied to a theological belief that gathering Jews in Israel is a prerequisite for Jesus' return. It's about eschatology, which, if you remember from the previous parts of this series on Christian Zionism, essentially just means the study of the supposed end times. And while IFCJ is technically a humanitarian organization, it is also deeply political, as most humanitarian organizations are. By focusing all of its aid within Israel, and in some cases in settlements that the international community considers illegal, it reinforces the status quo of occupation. And it does so, this is important, with the tax-exempt blessing of the United States government, because religious charities get a lot of leeway when it comes to where their money goes. These organizations, CUFI, IFCJ, and others like them, act as the connection between the donor class and the everyday churchgoer. I mean, I'm talking about the people who end up profiting and the people who are tithing and giving offerings to these campaigns. These organizations give pastors the sermon outlines, they give politicians the policy briefs, and they give the everyday churchgoers the emotional appeal to keep this machine going. And because they're framed as faith-based nonprofit organizations, they operate with minimal financial transparency compared to secular political organizations. You won't see the same kind of public accounting you'd expect from a political action committee, even though their influence is just as political. If CUFI and IFCJ are the institutional foundations for all of this, then we have to think of televangelists and how they are more like hype men. And again, they're the connection for that really emotional charged conversation about Zionism or the support for Israel. They're the ones they're called charismatic pastors for a reason. They're the ones who make sure the average Christian never stops feeling the urgency to pray, to give, and to politically mobilize for Israel. They've turned that urgency into a lucrative business model. And we can start with an example like Kenneth Copeland, because honestly, you can't talk about modern televangelism without mentioning the man who literally brags about being a rich preacher. Copeland Ministries has an entire section of their website dedicated to why it's so important to stand with Israel. They explicitly teach that if you give to Israel, God will bless you materially and spiritually. And if you don't, well, good luck with that. Pat Robertson, before he passed away, was running the Christian Broadcasting Network with a steady dose of prophecy content that framed Israel as the prophetic clock. His program, The 700 Club, routinely mixed humanitarian appeals with end times warnings, and the audience was primed to see every geopolitical event in the Middle East as a sign that Jesus was warming up to return. Again, this is something else I can attest to, because even as a middle schooler and a high schooler who had no concept of what was going on in the geopolitical realm of this world, every time something did happen in the Middle East, we would talk about it in my high school Bible class as something that was good, that there was tension rising in the Middle East, because it meant Jesus was about to come back, maybe even this year, guys. But anyway, networks like Trinity Broadcasting Network aired specials on Israel that are basically hour-long infomercials for Christian Zionist causes. You would get footage of IDF soldiers thanking American Christians for their support, heartstring-tugging stories of Holocaust survivors in need, and a host who reminds you every few minutes that those who bless Israel will be blessed. And yes, right after that, there's a phone number on the screen and a promise that your gift, ideally a regular monthly gift, will be put to immediate use. Author Sarah Posner, in her book God's Prophets, explains how televangelists operate like CEOs of religious media empires. They use religious language to build trust, then monetize that trust through books, DVDs, conferences, anointed merchandise, and of course, donation appeals. And because many of these ministries are classified as churches under United States tax law, they don't have to file the same detailed financial disclosures that, again, secular nonprofits do. So when you send $50 to Stand with Israel, you have no legal right to know exactly how that money is spent. The financial incentive here should be obvious, but isn't necessarily. Fear and urgency drive donations, period, full stop. If you tell people to give to hungry children in a conflict zone, you'll get some donations. But if you tell them, give to fulfill biblical prophecy and secure your own blessings before the rapture happens, you'll get a lot more. And you can keep asking week after week because in this theological framework, the prophecy is never quite fulfilled. Isn't that super convenient? There's always one more step, one more battle, one more opportunity for you to be obedient with your money and your tithe and your offering. It's worth noting that these televangelists also serve as key amplifiers for the policy goals of groups like CUFI. When the Trump administration moved the embassy to Jerusalem, a parade of prophecy preachers went on air to frame it as a divine milestone. The policy then turns into theological proof of the prophecy, which then gets spun into a new wave of donation appeals. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Policy to prophecy, prophecy to donations, donations to more lobbying for policy. It's cyclical. And all of this happens with a level of financial opacity. No itemized public records, no independent audits for the average donor to see, just a constant flow of money from believers and everyday Christians, their bank accounts, into an ecosystem that blends religion, politics, and business so tightly that you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. By this point in the series, we've already established that Christian Zionism isn't just a set of religious beliefs. It is a political movement with real-world consequences. But here's where it gets even more concrete. Lobbying, and the scale of influence here is staggering. Let's start with the baseline. The United States sends $3.8 billion every year in military aid to Israel. That figure comes from a 2016 Memorandum of Understanding signed under the Obama administration, a 10-year, $38 billion deal. The Congressional Research Service explains it plainly. $3.3 billion in foreign military financing, plus another $500 million annually for missile defense programs. Christian Zionist lobbying is one of the forces ensuring that this aid remains untouchable no matter what's happening on the ground. And when I say untouchable, I mean that even during moments when Israel is facing credible accusations of human rights violations, including from organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, any suggestion of conditioning or reducing aid gets shut down almost immediately. How? Well, CUFI and AIPAC have a symbiotic relationship. AIPAC has decades of experience and a well-oiled lobbying machine in DC. CUFI brings the mass evangelical base and the ability to flood congressional offices with calls, emails, and in-person visits from constituents who have been primed by their pastors and prophecy preachers on TV, online, and in, everyday sermons. According to Open Secrets, CUFI has spent millions of dollars lobbying Congress, often on the same bills AIPAC supports, including measures that restrict aid to Palestinians or that criminalize support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Consider anti-BDS legislation, for example. These bills aim to penalize individuals and businesses that choose to boycott Israeli goods, which many do as a nonviolent protest against settlement expansion and apartheid conditions in the West Bank. CUFI frames these laws as defending Israel from discrimination, while civil liberties groups point out that they're unconstitutional restrictions on free speech. But in the world of Christian Zionist lobbying, nuance isn't the point. They don't give a fuck about any of that. Their point is to keep the United States government fully aligned with Israeli policies and to punish any deviation from that alignment. Pro-Israel political action committees, including those aligned with Christian Zionist priorities, pour campaign contributions into the coffers of candidates who toe the line. Open Secrets data shows millions in contributions each election cycle, targeting key committee members and swing district representatives. And remember, these contributions often come on top of the grassroots pressure from congregations back home. A member of Congress might get a $10,000 check from a pro-Israel political action committee and also face 500 phone calls from constituents in 1 week because their pastor told them that a particular vote was a blessing or curse moment. Again, going back to blessing Israel so that you'll be blessed, all of that. And the result of this is a political environment where questioning United States support for Israel is treated as political suicide. And that's the goal here. Christian Zionist lobbying has helped create a bipartisan consensus, at least at the leadership level, that Israel is beyond reproach. That consensus is maintained not just through campaign donations, but through constant relationship building, trips to Israel, photo ops at CUFI summits, private dinners with mega donors. And because CUFI and similar groups are religious nonprofits, they can coordinate a lot of this without the same disclosure requirements that apply again to secular lobbying organizations. God, I'm so fucking sick of religion on this planet. Anyway, it's one thing to talk about standing with Israel in the abstract or like sending aid for humanitarian projects inside Israel's 1967 borders. It's another thing entirely to funnel millions of United States tax-exempt dollars directly into the illegal settlements deep in the occupied West Bank, settlements that even the United States State Department until recently called violations of international law. And this is why Christian Zionism is the most dangerous and harmful belief in the United States. The New York Times did an investigation back in 2010 showing how U.S. nonprofits, many of them Christian, were funding not just housing and settlements, but also bulletproof vests, rifle scopes, and guard dogs for settlers. We're talking about American churches and ministries raising money from Sunday offerings from everyday people and late-night TV viewers and sending it overseas to pay for the security infrastructure of an apartheid system. And because these organizations are registered as charities, all of it is tax deductible. This is insane. You can literally fund the occupation, the colonial project of Israel, and get a break on your federal income taxes for doing it. And here's the somehow even really galling part. The IRS has no category for apartheid funding. If you're a religious nonprofit, the bar for what qualifies as charitable is shockingly low. As long as you can make a case that the money serves your mission, in this case, a theological commitment to supporting Israel, you can raise and spend millions with almost no scrutiny. So when people tell me that Christianity is just about faith or a relationship with Jesus Christ, I think about those bulletproof vests and the rifle scopes. I think about the playgrounds and gyms in Israeli settlements on top of Palestinian land built with the tithe money from American churches. And I think about how Palestinians living under occupation and genocide don't just face an Israeli military presence, they face an American evangelical financial presence too. Christianity is not just a relationship with Jesus Christ. Christianity is this. It is violence. I'm so fucking sick of it. Let me try and break this down. If you've ever donated to a charity that helps with disaster relief, you know how these appeals usually go. Here's the crisis, here's who's suffering, and here's how your money can help. With Christian Zionist humanitarian aid, the pitch can sound similar until you look at the fine print and realize the aid is serving a political agenda. Let's go back to organizations like the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, which we already talked about for its prophecy, guilt, fear, fundraising tactics. Many of its programs are framed as emergency relief, food for poor families, housing for Holocaust survivors, evacuation assistance during rocket attacks, and yes, those are real needs, but the way these programs are structured almost always aligns with a specific eschatological goal. Again, gathering Jews to fulfill the end times prophecy of the Bible. It's honestly like so weird. What is going on that in 2025 so many people still believe in biblical prophecy? Are you dead fucking serious right now? Be fucking for real. That's insane. So after conflicts in Gaza or rocket attacks on Israeli cities, Christian Zionist groups will launch urgent fundraising drives for victims of terror. But those victims in this framing are almost always Jewish Israelis, which is like, of course, everyone deserves to be free from violence and hunger and everything. But Palestinian suffering in this context, even when it's caused by the same event, is either ignored or painted as part of the prophetic plan, or they're incorrectly labeled as the aggressors. It can be anything. It's just selective compassion. And this isn't a moral failing. It's not an accident. It's an intentional design. As long as Palestinian suffering is interpreted as fulfilling biblical prophecy, there's no moral obligation to alleviate it. In fact, doing so might be seen as interfering with God's plan. I talk about how growing up indoctrinated to be a Zionist as a child, I never once heard about the Palestinians. Their existence was completely erased from the narrative. We were just supporting Israel because they're God's chosen people. So then some groups take it even a step further with outright missionary aid, humanitarian programs with an embedded goal of conversion. These can range from subtle distributing aid along with Christian literature, to aggressive, requiring participation in Bible studies or evangelical events to receive help. And this goes beyond just Christian Zionism. Honestly, this is Christian missionary work as a whole. These organizations operate under the banner of religion, and so they often escape the scrutiny that other secular, non-governmental organizations face. There's no requirement to keep theological motives separate from humanitarian work, no watchdog demanding that they serve all populations equally. If their mission statement says their goal is to bless Israel or prepare for the Lord's return, they can target their aid accordingly and still qualify for nonprofit status. That net effect is that charity becomes another form of colonizations, a way to spiritually occupy the same ground that's being physically occupied by settlements and military outposts. This isn't about meeting people's needs neutrally. It's about shaping the religious and political landscape of the region in ways that match a very specific end times vision. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Without millions of everyday Christians giving small amounts, $20 here, $50 here, $100 here, the whole machine wouldn't work. The grassroots give it legitimacy, scale, and a constant revenue stream. So here's how it plays out in a typical evangelical church. A guest speaker from an Israel-focused nonprofit is invited to preach. They'll bring stirring photos, maybe a short video showing rockets intercepted over Tel Aviv. They'll quote Genesis 12:3, "I will bless those who bless you and curse whoever curses you," and tell the congregation this is a literal, ongoing promise from God to anyone who materially supports Israel. The pastor will then call for a special offering, assuring everyone that every dollar will go to bless God's people. But where does it actually go? Often that money is sent to a US-based nonprofit partner, an organization like Friends of the IDF, or a Christian ministry with the Support Israel branch. And from there, it may fund anything from care packages to Israeli soldiers, to playgrounds and settlements, to more abstract educational outreach that's really just political lobbying and propaganda materials in disguise. All of this makes the grassroots layer both the most sincere and the most exploited aspect of all of the money behind Christian Zionism. These are people who genuinely believe they're obeying God, but in reality, their donations are being siphoned into a system that props up apartheid infrastructure, it fuels the military occupation of Palestinian land, and strengthens the political hand of the Israeli regime. The tragedy is that if you told most of these donors the full truth about where their money was going, many of them would be horrified. They don't want bad things to happen to people, but they don't hear that truth in their churches or on the Christian TV networks or at their prophecy conferences or even online. They hear the same curated narrative over and over again. This is your calling, this is your duty, this is how you can be eternally blessed. The beneficiaries of the system are clear, though: Israeli senators, US-backed Christian Zionist organizations, political candidates who toe the line, and the network of televangelists and nonprofits that keep the machine running. But the people paying the price, literally and figuratively, are Palestinians living under occupation and genocide. So here we are, from billionaires and megadonors, through the power organizations, through the televangelists, the lobbying, the settlement builders, the missionary humanitarian organizations, and the everyday Christian tithers. Christian Zionism sells itself as faith, as an ideology, as obedience to God, as fulfilling prophecy. But if you follow the paper trail, the money, and the tax forms, and the donor lists, and the travel itineraries, you'll find something else entirely. You find capitalism, colonialism, greed, fear, violence. You find an industry that's monetized eschatology, where prophecy is the marketing strategy, and militarized apartheid is the product. The whole pipeline works because it's wrapped in a story that believers already believe. God blesses those who bless Israel. That's the hook. Once you accept that premise, the rest is just application. Blessing Israel becomes whatever the people holding the microphone tells you it is. Sending checks to settlement projects, voting for candidates who will move embassies and pass anti-BDS laws, etc. And because it's framed as spiritual obedience, questioning it, again, feels like questioning God himself, he, him pronouns. At the end of the day, Christian Zionism is a capitalist theology. And like any capitalist enterprise, it depends on consumers, in this case, believers, buying what it's selling. If enough people stop buying, the market collapses. I am begging everyday Christians to question this more intentionally. Why are your pastors telling you to support Israel? How are they benefiting from that cash flow from your pockets to settlements in Israel? I know firsthand that it takes a lot of time and energy to truly challenge your internal ideological beliefs. It took me years to deconstruct the indoctrination of evangelical Christianity I was raised in, but we have got to do it. At this point, I don't give a fuck about our eternal souls. People are being displaced, ethnically cleansed, and starved, and you're worried about your pastor getting their cut from a pro-Israel organization? Get the fuck out of here. I'm over it. I do appreciate everyone for tuning in to this series on Christian Zionism. If you missed the first couple of segments in this series, I encourage you to go back and check them out. Additionally, I have altered my live streaming schedule so that you can catch me on both YouTube and Twitch on Sundays and Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Central. I would love to see you then.